Hello everybody, this is Derek with Reef Automation. This is episode 14 of the GHL Vs Apex series. And in this episode we're going to finally give my review of both of the units. And in this episode I'm going to go step by step in each device and show you what I think and some of the pros and cons of each device and give you my opinion on each unit. So to begin, we're going to start with the appearance of the devices. So we're going to start with the GHL first. So the GHL comes in a black and a silver finish, as you can see here. It's got tactile buttons on the front and it's got a logo on the top. What I like about the GHL and how it looks is that it does give you an indicator in terms of color on the top of it to tell you if something is wrong. So for instance, right now it would be blue. That means everything's working just fine. But it also has the ability to show you a red color to tell you that there's something wrong. And I found that to be pretty neat. You can change the brightness of that color. You can actually even change how it works. You can change it to be flashing, you can change it to be solid, you can change it to a number of different things. You can also have it just come on when there's an alarm and not come on when there isn't an alarm. So in terms of appearance, that's a really nice feature. The front shows you a good amount of information. I did find that the buttons were a little bit difficult to use on the GHL even after calibrating them quite a bit. And that was the only flaw that I found, is the buttons on the front. The buttons on the front were really difficult for me to use and therefore difficult for me to control the system from the display. Other than that, I think it's a very nice looking piece of equipment. So for that I'm going to give it 4 stars. I think it's a great piece of equipment. I think it looks nice. I can definitely tell you if I had this in my house, this would not be an eyesore whatsoever. So I'm going to give it a 4 stars overall. Like I said, taking a star off mainly for the display issue and the button issue that I had. But overall I'm going to give it a 4 star. So next we're going to go on to the Apex. So the Apex looks pretty nice when you first open it up. One thing about the Apex that I did notice is it's a little large. If you're planning on mounting this to something, you're going to need a good amount of clearance. I would give it, I think it's about 3 or 4 inches deep. What I found in the unit that I actually didn't like was the connection on the bottom. They do have an ability for you to flip up the unit and get to the connections a little bit easier, but in my case, if I have this mounted to a board, for instance, I don't like having the connections on the bottom. I wish they had a little slimmer connection point, such as their older unit that they used to have, where it was a nice slim form factor and you'd plug everything into the bottom. I understand how they went about doing this, but that's the only thing I didn't like about the Apex base station, is that it is a little bit bulky and it does have the connections on the bottom. Otherwise it's pretty well made and it looks really nice. But I'm going to give this guy 3 stars for the appearance of the Apex. I personally don't like the orange and silver color, but I've seen people that really like that on the unit, so I'm going to give it 3 stars. So the GHL, we're going to give it 4 stars. We're going to give the Apex 3 stars for appearance. So the next thing we're going to discuss is the pricing of both of the units. So both of the units are relatively expensive, so just be aware before you purchase one of these that you're going to spend some money on them. They do have some cheaper options that you can find with some of their lower end products, like the Apex EL, and the GHL has a different Provolux series that's a little bit reasonably priced. The ones that we used in this series ran $800 for the GHL and $700 for the Apex. So in that regard, I'm probably going to give the GHL and the Apex both 4 stars. I believe the price is reasonable for what you get for both of them. And also, of course, both of them have expansion modules that let you expand on the system. So I'm going to give it 4 stars. I'm not going to give it 5 stars because I think it's a little bit expensive for some of us. But overall, in the controller world, I find these to be relatively well priced and even in terms of their pricing. So next we're going to go over mounting options of both the GHL and the Apex. So for mounting, I kind of touched on it a little bit earlier. The GHL really doesn't have a very good mounting option. So I'm going to give them 1 star. Now let me explain. The PAB, or the power bar that they make, you can mount. However, the actual system itself, there's no way to mount it. And all of their products that they sell, such as the ion director, their dosers, everything they sell, with the exception of their power bar and a few other small things, there is no way to mount it. So you would have to build something custom with shelves. So there's a lot more involved to get the GHL on a system in terms of mounting. So I'm going to give it 1 star. I give the Apex 5 stars in this ability. All of their devices, including their doser, including their expansion boxes, everything that they make, their power bars, all have mounting ability. The only thing that doesn't have a mounting ability is a Trident. However, there are many people out there making 3D printed parts, so you can mount your Trident. Whereas with the GHL, you do have to buy something, possibly a 3D printed mount. It's really difficult to mount them. You have to stack them on top of each other. I really don't like putting electronics stacked on top of each other, especially around water. So I'm going to give GHL 1 star here, and I'm going to give Apex 5 stars. So next we're going to go over the connectivity of both of the devices. So when we talk about connections, I'm talking about the base unit itself and only the base unit. So one of the things that I did not like about GHL is it does not have Ethernet. It's all wireless. And when using the system, I found it very difficult to get the wireless working stable. I had to change a couple little things on my wireless connection in my home, and the GHL just stopped working completely. So I had to end up resetting it, redoing the configuration. When I first got the GHL, it was very difficult to get going, if you recall from my previous episodes. I skimmed that 45 minutes that I had down to 2 minutes. It actually took me roughly 45 minutes to an hour to get the GHL on my network, whereas the Apex took me less than 3 minutes to get going. If I didn't get the Apex going via the Wi-Fi, I still had the option for Ethernet, where the GHL does not have that period. Now, on the other hand, the GHL does have a lot of connections, so I'm going to give it a 3 star. It does have all of the connections, including additional connections on top of it, all at the base unit itself. Whereas with the Apex, you do need to get additional modules to get some of the functionality. So for Apex, I'm going to give it 4 stars. And the reason I'm going to give it 4 stars is because it does have the Ethernet capability, whereas the GHL does not have that. So in terms of connections, the Apex has almost everything the GHL has. However, the GHL does have a lot of extra stuff that is either not being used or not even available anymore, such as the display. So for connectivity, I have to give it to Apex just because they have that Ethernet connection, and I think that's huge to have, especially when you're working with something that is stabilizing life. Whereas, you never know with Wi-Fi. You could have an interference, and I don't want to rely on my tank having an interference and then my whole tank going down because of it. So the next thing we're going to go over is the initial setup of both of the devices. So as I previously mentioned, when I set up the GHL, I've had a lot of problems. It took me probably 45 minutes to set up the thing. I had Wi-Fi issues. I had to refresh firmware. There was a number of things that I ran into. I don't think that's common with most of the setups. I did find it online that most people with iPhones have this issue and Android does not have this issue. So it's hard for me to kind of review experience in terms of initial setup with with other people. My experience, I had a lot of trouble, so unfortunately I have to give the GHL 2 stars for their initial setup. From what I'm being told, they're working on it and it's going to get better, but as it stands, I really did not like setting up the GHL. It took me a long time and there was some connection issues, and now over the period of 2 months I've had it disconnect twice on me. So I'm going to say initial setup a 2 on the GHL. In terms of the Apex, I'm going to give it a 5, and the reason I'm going to give it a 5 is they do now have an Android app now that does the same setup that the iPhone app did that I had, and it was so fast. It probably took me 3 minutes total to do it, and it was just very, very simple to get going right away. So I have to give the Apex 5 stars. So next we're going to go over what it actually looks like when you get to the dashboard. So if we look at the dashboard on both of them, I found that the GHL is a little bit robotic looking. It's not very eye-popping. They don't have the dark mode, which Apex just implemented. So overall, I'm going to give the dashboard a 3 star. It's functional. It's kind of easy to read in certain areas, but for a standard user or someone that just got the system, I did find this to be not very pleasing to the eye overall and kind of difficult at times to use. So unfortunately, I got to give the GHL 3 stars for their display. So on the Apex, I think it looks really nice. It's got bold colors. Again, I don't really like the orange color, but either way, it's nice and easy to understand. It's big. There's a lot of features on here. You can zoom in and out of it very easily. Overall, it looks nice. Also, the dark mode that they just released is really fantastic. When I'm putting this up on an iPad to show everybody, I don't like how the other one on the GHL is so robotic looking and stiff. There's no colors. It's not very pleasing to the eye. As you can see on the Apex, it's nice, bold, easy to read, and again, aesthetically pleasing to the eye. So I'm going to give Apex 5 stars for their dashboard. I think it's above and beyond better than the GHL. So GHL, we're going to give you 3 stars. Apex, we're going to give you 5 stars for your dashboard. So the next thing we're going to go over is the speed of the unit and how quickly it accomplishes things. So when we talk about speed, I'm talking about when we first connect to the system, how long it takes to actually functionally do things. So we're going to start with the GHL, and we're going to do a live demo of the GHL. When I click on the Provolux, this is how long it takes for things to come up. This is live in real time, how long it takes for their switch channels, their maintenance, and their charts to pop up. And as you can see, the amount of time it takes for their dashboard to pop up is quite astonishing. And I found overall using the GHL, no matter what I did, this is how slow it was when I tried to get to things. And you can still see the maintenance is still trying to come in here. So unfortunately, I have to give the GHL 1 star. It is so slow, it's almost unbearable at times when I'm trying to connect to this. And this is the same thing with their app, and it's the same thing with any web browser that you're using, is it continues to always be slow. So it's going to be slow no matter what you're using. That's how slow the GHL is, unfortunately. And I have to give it 1 star because it's just too slow. So let's do a demonstration now of the Apex. So I have 2 tanks here. We're going to go to the demo tank that I've been using, and I'm going to hit reef, and it's already there. That's how quick the Apex is in comparison to the GHL. If I click on anything and I make a change, so if I was to say fall back off and I wanted to make a change, I would hit the little guy up here and watch how quickly it sends the signal to the system. Done. Already done. If I come back to the main system, I can get all my information. If I want to get a chart, I can click on charts here, and there's my chart right away. So as you can see, the Apex is much quicker. And this is on anything. This is on their apps. This is on their web browser. It is significantly faster, and I have to give Apex a 5 in terms of their speed. GHL, unfortunately, it's just way too slow. There are times where it locks up. There are times where I've clicked on things to make a change, and it just doesn't go. I have to tell you that overall this was I would say one of the bigger parts of using the GHL that I disliked the most, which was the speed. The speed was just so unbearably slow. So next we're going to go over the calibration. So during the calibration process, I ran into a couple issues with both of the systems. So it was kind of hard to gauge whether one was better than the other. GHL, you have to do all your calibrations from the front display, whereas with the Apex, you can just pick up a computer and go somewhere and do the calibration. You can also do it on your phone. The GHL, again, you have to do everything from the display. So for the calibration, I'm actually going to give both of the systems a 3 star, and I'll explain why. The GHL, while the calibration was easy to do, it did take a little longer than the Apex, and I didn't like the fact that you had to do it all from the display. For instance, if you're trying to calibrate a tank somewhere, you're not going to want to pull your display out and push all the buttons. Generally, you're going to want to just do it from a computer real quick, possibly from a laptop, possibly from your phone or an iPad. Whereas in the Apex, you can do that. The GHL, you cannot do that. The Apex also, the reason I give it 3 stars is I did have some calibration issues, and I'm not sure why. but it did take a long time for some of the calibration to stick. Both of them aren't like fantastic at calibration, but I'm going to give them both 3 stars because the calibration does work and it does hold after it's done. So for both of them, I'm going to give them both 3 stars. So the next one we're going to go over is programming. We're going to actually go over 2 different reviews on the programming. So the first thing I'm going to go over is programming for beginners in my review of if you were a beginner, what you would experience if you had the GHL or the Apex. So when you first set up the system, there's a couple differences between the two. Now the Apex actually already has programming already done for you for the outlets, and the GHL does not. Nothing's programmed in the GHL. So there's a big difference when you first get the whole system set up, what I believe is easier and better. The GHL, I'm going to give you 2 stars, and let me explain. The 2 stars are given to the GHL because I found when you first get this thing set up, it's not that difficult to figure out how to get your heater going, your chiller going, and basic stuff. However, it was really difficult when I first got it to figure that out, even as a new programmer, where that is, how to get to it. It's a little convoluted how you have 2-step processes to get it programmed. So it's a little bit different in how they program it. I'm not going to give them 1 star. I think the programming is actually quite simple once you figure it out. However, I have to give the Apex 5 stars on this, and let me explain. The 5 stars is for their tasks. The fact that Apex has a button that you press and it programs everything for you is leaps and bounds better than the GHL. Whereas the GHL doesn't have any way of knowing what you're doing other than going online and looking some knowledge base, possibly getting some information. The videos are out there, but they're not wonderful for people that are new. So overall, I got to give the Apex 5, especially since some of them are already programmed for you once you get the system, which I think is huge for new programmers. So when you first start programming the GHL and get more advanced, I think it's one of the most difficult programs I've had to work with. And the reason it is because of the way that they label things. So they label leak detectors, for instance, as water fill, which absolutely makes no sense to me. They make filter pump for their feed modes. There's just some really strange labeling. Doing anything more advanced, such as adding things to other things, or for instance in my videos I said, well, if you have a skimmer and you just want to shut it off, well, what do? Well, you got to do 4 steps, and you got to figure out how the 4 steps interact with each other. It was so difficult for me, and I have to give GHL 1 star for the programming for more advanced users. It is dismal. This is something they need to fix. They need to fix how they label things. They need to fix how things actually operate for the end user. Imagine getting into a GHL and wanting to do leak detection, and it's called water fill. That makes absolutely no sense. So I was very, very frustrated when I started to get into that functionality of the GHL. Now the Apex, I'm going to give 4 stars. Their advanced programming is quite simple. It's line coded. You can just say if something, else something, and you can put it in a line, and that's all you have to do, which I showed in my advanced video. The one thing I don't like about Apex is there's really no ways to do ors, ands, and things where you want something and something and something to work together at the same time, where the GHL does provide that feature. The Apex has virtual outlets, which accomplishes what I just said, but for an advanced programmer, that might be a little more difficult than you would think. So I'm going to give them 4 stars because the Apex programming for more advanced users is so much better than the GHL for advanced users. So that's basically the first 10 things that I reviewed here in episode 14. In episode 15, I'm going to go through the next 10 items that I'm going to review, and I'm also going to do a complete overview of both of the systems and their final scores. So if you haven't already, hit the thumbs up if you liked the video, and go ahead and subscribe if you haven't done so already. You can see all of the Apex versus GHL series right here. And thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.